There was a time when Bud Light didn't just sell beer, it set the default for American fun. For nearly 20 years, it was the unchallenged king of the cooler, the blue label that showed up everywhere without needing an invitation, from plastic cups at college tailgates to $15 drafts at NFL stadiums and quiet backyard barbecues where nobody even bothered to ask what brand was on tap. Not only was it America's best-selling beer, it was the background music of everyday life, so common it became invisible. Bars ordered it by the pallet, wholesalers treated it as a guaranteed river of money, and entire local economies quietly leaned on that river. This was an empire built on habit more than hype, on the comfort of knowing that when someone said, "grab a beer," they probably meant Bud Light. Then, in the spring of 2023, the king tripped over a single can. A limited, personalized Bud Light can sent to one influencer, Dylan Mulvaney, for a March Madness promo. One short Instagram video. Not a nationwide product launch, not a sweeping rebrand, just a tiny gesture in the sprawling machinery of modern marketing. Yet within days, that gesture detonated into a national spectacle. Social media lit up. Comment sections turned into battlegrounds. Country musicians filmed themselves dumping cases of Bud Light. Viral clips showed people shooting cans, crushing them, swearing they would never drink it again. Because of that one partnership, the brand was yanked into the center of America's culture wars, treated less like a light beer and more like a political manifesto. What followed was fast and ruthless. Longtime customers called for boycotts. Hashtags spread faster than any ad campaign Bud Light had ever paid for. Distributors, who had once counted on steady, predictable orders, suddenly panicked as sales in key regions dropped by double digits. Shelves that had been dominated by blue started making room for green and gold. While Twitter raged, Modelo Especial quietly slid into the #1 slot, taking the crown Bud Light had worn for decades in a matter of weeks. But this story is bigger than one influencer, one can, or even one brand. It's an example of what happens when a mass-market product stumbles into a cultural crossfire it doesn't understand and loses control of its own identity overnight. Was this a tale of corporate courage that backfired, or of corporate cowardice that pleased no one? Did Bud Light reach for a new audience and forget the family that had built its empire in the first place? Let me take you back to the night the king fell, to a moment when a light beer revealed something dark about power, identity, and who really decides what America drinks next. In the weeks after that night, headlines made it sound simple. One can, one influencer, one boycott, and the king was dead. But this isn't just a story about a beer ad gone wrong. It's a story about power, about how public anger can turn a logo into a weapon, and about how a company that once felt untouchable discovered it had far less control than it thought. On the surface, Bud Light's fall looks like a tactical marketing failure. A limited partnership with Dylan Mulvaney, a trans creator, a personalized can, a short March Madness clip, and then chaos. Yet underneath the noise, something far more chilling was happening. Years of simmering resentment, culture war fatigue, and distrust of big brands suddenly had a target. It's an example of what happens when a symbol of easygoing American fun is dragged into a fight that millions of people were already having in their own lives. There was a time when Bud Light meant something very different. Let me take you back to the era of blockbuster Super Bowl commercials, tailgates outside packed stadiums, and that effortless king of beers swagger. For roughly 2 decades, it was the default choice. The background music of barbecues, college parties, and family reunions. Not the most flavorful, not the most expensive, but the most familiar. That familiarity was its real empire, built quietly, can by can, over years when nobody thought much about what their beer said about them. Then, almost overnight, that same familiarity turned into fuel. The Mulvaney Post lit the match, but social media outrage carried the flame. Country musicians filming themselves dumping cases, bar owners complaining on local news, online calls to boycott that spread faster than any paid campaign. While Twitter raged, distributors fielded panicked calls, shelves were rearranged, and Modelo Especial quietly moved into the space Bud Light had once owned without question. This story operates on two levels at once. On one hand, it is a cautionary tale about ignoring your core customer, about leaders who misread the identity of the people who had made them number one, and then froze when those people felt mocked or replaced. On the other, it is at times inspiring and at times chilling, a reminder that even modest gestures toward inclusion can be turned into a battlefield where no response feels safe and silence can be as loud as a slogan. So here is the promise of what comes next. The story will rewind to Bud Light's long, easy rise, then move into the moment the Mulvaney partnership went live, the mechanics of the boycott, the hard sales data that crowned Modelo, and finally the lessons any brand or creator will have to learn if they want to survive the next wave. Was Bud Light undone by one decision, or by years of quiet drift and arrogance that made that decision explosive the instant it landed? To answer that, the story has to start long before the backlash and end long after the first viral video faded from the feed. To understand how that one decision detonated, there was a time when you have to see what Bud Light had become long before hashtags and boycotts. Not just a cheaper, lighter offshoot of Budweiser, but a blue-labeled background noise that quietly ruled American drinking life. Let me take you back to the 1980s and 90s, when light beer stopped being an experiment and turned into an empire. Bud Light began as the sensible cousin of the king of beers, a way to keep the family name on tap as waistlines and health worries crept into the culture. But because Anheuser-Busch already controlled the rails of distribution, that side project did not stay small. It rode the same trucks, the same wholesalers, the same national deals, until the offshoot eclipsed the original and for roughly 2 decades became America's best-selling beer. Because of that distribution muscle and money, Bud Light didn't just appear on shelves, it colonized them. Chains signed exclusive or near-exclusive agreements. Grocery aisles turned into blue walls. Bar owners who wanted the Budweiser tap handle often had to take Bud Light too, and then more Bud Light, and then maybe a few more cases for game day. Over time, the mechanics of dominance looked almost boring. Shelf space contracts, volume discounts, national sports sponsorships, a marketing budget that dwarfed entire competitors' revenues. Yet that boredom was the point. It made Bud Light feel like the safe, neutral choice. The brand slid into American rituals so completely that people stopped noticing it. College parties where the keg was just assumed to be Bud Light. NFL Sundays where the logo sat on every commercial break, every stadium sign, every plastic cup. Country concerts, NASCAR weekends, lake trips, summer cookouts where showing up with anything else could feel like a statement. It was the beer you ordered when you did not want to send a signal about class, politics, or taste. You just wanted a cold one. That's the invisible empire phase, when a product stops feeling like a decision and starts feeling like weather. His story is one of ruthless control and meticulous logistics. Bud Light's is one of quiet saturation, at times inspiring and at times chilling in its efficiency. Generations grew up with the same colorkin, the same ads about friendship and fun, the same reassuring sense that nothing here would ever really change. but it's an example of what happens when ubiquity turns into entitlement. When a brand becomes family background, any hint that it has taken aside doesn't land as a marketing tweak. It feels like betrayal at the dinner table. So when one influencer held up one personalized can on one platform, millions were primed to read it as something much bigger than a promo. The question is, how did a quiet Instagram post manage to crack an empire that had been invisible for decades? And why did the first fractures appear not online, but in the cold glow of bar taps and grocery coolers? There was a time when Bud Light knew exactly who it was. Cold, cheap, everywhere. The beer of tailgates and deer camps, union halls and backyard weddings with folding chairs and sheet cake. Not glamorous, not aspirational, just reliable. But while those drinkers kept buying 30-packs, something inside its corporate life was quietly shifting. Let me take you back to the moment Bud Light stopped being the center of its own story. In 2008, when Anheuser-Busch was folded into AB InBev, the scrappy American lager suddenly became one SKU in a global empire. Not only was it the top-selling beer in the United States, it was now sitting in a portfolio that stretched from Stella Artois to Corona, across continents, currencies, and boardrooms. Decisions that once lived in St. Louis barrooms and Midwestern focus groups now flowed through PowerPoints in New York, Leuven, and São Paulo. With that scale came pressure, ruthless pressure. Beer volume in the US was flat or shrinking. Younger drinkers were drifting to seltzers, cocktails, and anything with a flavor that didn't taste like Dad's fridge. Yet Wall Street still expected growth, more money, more wealth, every quarter. So executives went hunting for a new kind of relevance. Younger, more urban, more progressive, the crowd posting their lives from rooftop bars instead of VFW parking lots. The shift showed up first in the ads. There was a time when Bud Light's commercials were blue-collar skits about bad bosses, football rituals, and the friend who'd do anything for another round. Then slowly, the tone polished. More cinematic lighting, more coastal skylines, more social media-ready party scenes where everyone looked like they had a brand deal and no one looked like they shopped for beer at a rural Walmart at 10 p.m. on a Thursday. For longtime drinkers, nothing explicit was said. No press release announced, "We're moving on." But they could feel the drift. The humor felt less like their family and more like someone else's curated life. The language in interviews shifted to inclusivity, cultural relevance, premiumization, terms that play well on earnings calls, even if they land strangely next to a mud-splattered pickup and a cooler in the back. Inside the company, an internal culture lag was growing. Brand managers in New York high-rises and European offices started imagining the Bud Light drinker as an Instagram native, a coastal 20-something chasing experiences. Meanwhile, the reality was still warehouse workers, oil field crews, small-town bartenders, ringing up 30-packs and draft specials. The people with the power pictured one life. The people with the cash register saw another. It's an example of what happens when a brand's self-image drifts too far from the people who actually keep it alive. That gap can stay invisible for years, hidden under habit and inertia. But once the distance is wide enough, all it takes is one spark, one can, one post to light up the fault line and show everyone just how far apart they've finally grown. That spark had a name, a face, and a ring light. Dylan Mulvaney was not a movie star, not a politician, not a CEO. She was a TikTok creator who had turned her life into a daily, serialized story for millions. A trans woman documenting days of girlhood with a bubbly, theatrical style, Broadway energy, and a kind of relentless optimism that made her polarizing long before any beer showed up on her doorstep. To her fans, she was charming and brave. To her critics, she was already a symbol of everything they thought had gone too far. There was a time when that kind of internet fame would have stayed in its own lane, but by 2023, influencers like Dylan were distribution channels. Brands courted them the way they once courted TV networks, hoping to borrow a little of that attention, that youth, that social currency. From the corporate side, the logic was simple. If the next generation lives on TikTok and Instagram, then the empire has to follow them there, can in hand. So what did Bud Light actually do? Not a national can redesign, not a rainbow takeover of every shelf in America. The real collaboration was tiny. The company sent Dylan a personalized Bud Light can with her face on it to celebrate 365 days of girlhood, and paid her for a small March Madness Instagram promo, a single video, a custom can, a light caption about sports and prizes. On paper, it was routine, almost boring. In the marketing deck, this was textbook. Tap an influencer with massive reach. Signal inclusivity to younger drinkers without changing the product. Spend a little money to look modern, relevant, alive. His story is one of ruthless consolidation and monopoly. This was the opposite, a brand trying to look soft, human, relatable. There was no expectation that a quiet social post would threaten decades of sales dominance. But marketing decks don't live in a vacuum. Outside the conference room, the United States was already locked in a grinding cultural fight over trans rights, gender identity, and what counts as political in everyday life. Bathroom bills, sports bans, book removals, heated school board meetings. All of it had turned trans existence into a proxy war for deeper fears about family, power, and change. In that climate, a trans woman holding a beer can was never going to be just content. Let me take you back to that moment on Dylan's feed. For some viewers, it was at times inspiring and at times chilling, a joyful milestone in her life, sponsored by a brand that finally seemed to see her. For others, it was proof that even their fridge had been drafted into a culture war. The same image, two opposite stories. It's an example of what happens when a company thinks it is buying impressions, but is actually buying meaning. Because once a product becomes a symbol, it stops obeying marketing plans and starts obeying emotions. That's the point where a single can turn into a battlefield, and where the real explosion in Bud Light's world was about to begin. So let me take you back to the afternoon when that battlefield finally lit. It wasn't a Super Bowl ad, a national press conference, or a sweeping rebrand. It was Dylan Mulvaney sitting in her apartment, holding a single Bud Light can with her face on it and laughing about March Madness. The video itself was light, almost forgettable. She jokes that she doesn't know what teams are playing, waves the personalized can at the camera, mentions a promo code, and leans into the same playful, slightly chaotic energy that had already made her famous on TikTok. For Bud Light, this was a tiny, targeted gesture in a much bigger marketing calendar. For Dylan's audience, it looked like a routine Tuesday in the life of an influencer. There was a time when that would have been the end of the story. Her followers dropped supportive comments, heart emojis, and casual jokes about sports ball. Some teased her about finally drinking beer. Others tagged friends to grab the March Madness discount. Engagement numbers looked normal, then strong, then comfortably above average. On paper, the empire of light blue cans had just bought itself another neat slice of relevance. But because of the moment Bud Light was living in, and because of who Dylan was to the culture war, the video did not stay in that friendly bubble for long. Clips were ripped, trimmed, and reposted to Twitter by accounts already convinced that every brand was going woke. On Facebook, Screenshots of the can appeared in groups where trans rights were framed as an existential threat to family and faith. On TikTok, reaction videos stitched Dylan's laughter with outrage monologues, country music, and calls for boycotts. The tone changed instantly. What began as a small ad about money and basketball quietly morphed into a referendum on gender, patriotism, and who real Americans were allowed to be. A limited, personalized consent to one person was presented as if pallets of Dylan-branded Bud Light were rolling into every grocery store in the nation. It's an example of what happens when an image escapes the campaign that created it and falls into an ecosystem primed for maximum anger. Screenshots of the can traveled faster than any clarification. Short, out-of-context clips outpaced the full video. Within hours, the narrative hardened. Bud Light hadn't just sponsored a creator, it had betrayed its base. Because of that ruthless speed, any attempt to explain the tiny scale of the partnership sounded like a weak excuse, not a fact. So here is the uncomfortable question. Was the damage locked in the moment that first repost hit the right outrage accounts? Or could a different response from Bud Light's leaders still have contained the fire? The answer lies in what they did next, and in how quickly America's best-selling beer watched its wealth, its power, and finally its crown begin to slip. Because once the fire starts, the outrage machine does the rest. There was a time when a marketing misstep died in a boardroom memo, not on a million timelines. Now, the anatomy of outrage is almost mechanical. A clip surfaces, a screenshot circulates, and a handful of high-follower accounts rush in to frame the story, attach a moral label, and invite their audiences into a shared performance of anger. Not just, this was a bad ad, but this is an attack on you, your family, your life. With the Dylan Mulvaney can, that script locked in fast. Let me take you back to those first 48 hours. A small influencer video, filmed in a bathtub, talking about March Madness and a personalized Bud Light can. On its own, a blip. But then the framing hit. Commentators declaring that Bud Light had spit in the face of its base, that the brand had gone woke, that buying a 12-pack was now a political act. Because of that framing, a niche promo became a referendum on traditional America. Country musicians joined in, not with white papers, but with props. One star dragged cases of Bud Light offstage mid-concert. Another filmed himself switching the beer in his tour coolers. Conservative podcasters lined their desks with rival brands, turning each episode into a live boycott ad. Culture war influencers posted side-by-side images of blue-collar drinkers and Mulvaney's can, asking which America Bud Light really wanted. It was an example of what happens when a brand collides with an existing story people are already primed to tell. Then came the viral theater, clips of people shooting Bud Light cases in the woods, slow-motion videos of cans dumped into trash bins, grocery carts, and backyard bonfires. Bar owners announcing bans on camera, even in places where the sales data hadn't yet moved. The performance was the point. Outrage became content, and content became proof that the outrage was real. Each new video said, without needing words, "Everyone is turning on this empire. Are you still funding it?" The speed of narrative capture was ruthless. Within days, the story wasn't Bud Light did a small influencer ad. It was Bud Light chose a side against its own customers. The scale was exaggerated, the partnership misunderstood, but the emotional headline felt true to millions who already believed that big companies had abandoned them. Once that belief fused with a can of beer, every shelf became a battlefield. Here is the pattern interrupt. The company still had money, distribution, and the biggest beer network in America. On paper, it should have been untouchable. Yet the outrage machine made all that power feel strangely fragile. So a deeper question hangs over the story. When outrage itself becomes entertainment, when every boycott is also a chance to go viral, does any brand still have the power to step in and rewrite the script once it's gone live? The answer depends on what Bud Light did next, and on how quickly its enemies learned to weaponize its silence. So let me take you back to those first frantic days after the can went viral, when every social feed made it look like Bud Light's empire was collapsing in real time. Clips of bar taps being ripped out, pallets gathering dust, country stars swearing it off on stage. It felt like a mass exodus. But if you called certain distributors that week, the story sounded strangely calm. There was a time when some wholesalers in quieter regions were reporting that sales were fine. Not great, not catastrophic, just normal. Trucks still rolled, checks still cleared. To them, this was another outrage cycle that would flare, burn hot, and move on. Yet on TikTok and Twitter, the narrative had already hardened. Ordering Bud Light wasn't just buying a beer anymore, it was taking a side in a culture war. That is where the damage began to shift from pixels to real life. Because repeated viral clips do more than entertain. They write a social script. 1,000 videos of people dumping cases, 1,000 jokes about boycotting woke beer, quietly trained drinkers on what each choice meant. Asking the bartender for a Bud Light started to feel like raising a tiny flag over the bar. Reaching for a Modelo or a Coors. That suddenly felt safer, maybe even a little virtuous. In that environment, bar owners and store managers were not just thinking about money, they were thinking about confrontation. Many of them live in the same small towns as their customers, go to the same churches, send their kids to the same schools. Because of that, they did something subtle but ruthless. They stopped putting Bud Light in places where it would start arguments. Cases were nudged from eye level to the bottom shelf. Draft handles were moved from the center of the tap line to the edge. Some independents quietly cut their orders, telling distributors they did not want the headache. No press releases, no public statements, just a quiet rebalancing of power on the shelf and behind the bar. Then the feedback loop kicked in. A regular walks in, glances at the cooler, and notices less Bud Light. Maybe the stack that used to dominate the aisle is gone, replaced by a bright tower of Modelo Especial. The mind fills in the blanks. Everyone else must be boycotting. Nobody wants to be the last loyalist. So the regular reaches for something else, tells a friend, posts a photo, and the online narrative that once exaggerated reality begins to create it. Within weeks, those modest early dips in certain markets turned into double-digit declines nationwide. The brand that had been America's best-selling beer for roughly 2 decades was now visibly shrinking in real time. It is an example of what happens when perception, repetition, and fear of embarrassment combine into a new habit. Because the real wound wasn't just lost sales, it was that Bud Light, once the neutral background of American social life, had finally been recast as a political signal. And once a drink becomes a declaration, winning back silence is far harder than winning back share. There was a time when Bud Light's greatest challenge was a rival billboard on the highway. Now the challenge was something far more dangerous: silence. As the backlash over a single Dylan Mulvaney Instagram post roared through the country, the brand that had spent decades shouting fun suddenly went quiet. Days passed. Cans were shot on camera. Bars pulled tap handles. Distributors reported panicked calls from retailers, and from Anheuser-Busch came only vague, lawyerly lines about working with many influencers and authentic connections. It sounded less like a living brand and more like a filing cabinet. No clear defense, no clear apology, just language so carefully sanded down that it cut everyone. Inside the empire, reports later painted a picture that was at times inspiring and at times chilling for anyone who believes giant companies are always in control. Marketing teams tried to explain that this was a one-off March Madness promo, not a new national identity. PR staff drafted holding statements, redrafted them, then watched executives strike out anything that resembled a stance. Meanwhile, distributors, who actually felt the drop in money every week, begged for talking points they could use with angry store owners and bar managers. Because leadership hesitated, a vacuum opened. In that vacuum, social media decided what the story was. To some, Bud Light had become a symbol of wokeness. To others, it was a rare big brand gesture toward a trans creator now being punished. And in conference rooms from St. Louis to New York, people who had spent their careers selling light beer were suddenly trying to navigate America's fiercest cultural fault lines with spreadsheets and email chains. Finally, the CEO stepped forward with a public letter. He emphasized that the company never intended to be part of a discussion that divides people, and that the goal was simply to bring people together over beer. On paper, it sounded safe. In practice, it landed like a non-apology apology. No mention of Dylan Mulvaney by name. No acknowledgement of the real anger or the real support. Just a plea to move on. Because of that, the brand managed a rare feat, alienating both sides at once. Supporters of Dylan felt she had been quietly thrown under the bus, treated as a PR problem rather than a human face. Angry customers saw the letter as weak, evasive, and corporate, proof that the company cared more about quarterly numbers than any principle. It's an example of what happens when a brand tries to stand nowhere in a moment when everyone is being sorted into camps. So if words could no longer rescue Bud Light's life in American culture, maybe images could. Let me take you back to the moment the company reached for its oldest weapon, nostalgia. The Clydesdales were being saddled again, and the past was about to be dragged into the present. So the Clydesdales came thundering back, not as a cute Super Bowl cameo this time, but as emergency firefighters for a brand on life support. Wide frames of hooves pounding dirt, small-town main streets at golden hour, American flags rippling in slow motion, rain-soaked city streets glowing under neon as a lone truck rolled past a corner bar. Every shot screamed one message: remember, this is your beer, this is your country, this is timeless. There was a time when that formula was nearly unbeatable. For decades, Budweiser and Bud Light wrapped themselves in parades, ball games, backyard barbecues, military homecomings. The new wave of ads tried to drag that entire archive of feeling into 2023. No influencers, no hashtags, no speeches, just Clydesdales against skylines, farmers leaning on fences, friends clinking bottles while fireworks cracked overhead. The goal was clear: reconnect the brand to a safe, familiar American identity and quietly walk away from any one political flashpoint. Strategically, it was an attempt to stand above the fight by going back in time. If the Dylan Mulvaney can had turned Bud Light into a lightning rod, this campaign tried to turn it back into wallpaper. Always there, never controversial, background to family and friends and paychecks cashed on a Friday night. It was an appeal to memory, to a story of America where beer is neutral, uncomplicated, and definitely not a referendum on gender politics. But out in the real empire of social media, the reaction was ruthless. Many critics on the right mocked the pivot instantly, calling it too little, too late, accusing the company of slapping a flag over a wound it had opened itself. They pointed to the horses and the swelling music and saw panic, not pride. Meanwhile, Critics on the left looked at the same ad and saw a retreat, a quiet erasure of a small gesture of inclusion the brand had made, and then seemed terrified to stand behind. That clash exposed the tonal dissonance at the heart of the campaign. The images were glossy, sentimental, almost soothing. The conversation online was not. People were still arguing, still boycotting, still dissecting boardroom motives and quarterly earnings. Against that noise, the slow-motion Clydesdales felt like a postcard mailed into a hurricane, a calm voice insisting everything was fine while the sales charts were drawing a different picture. Here's the pattern interrupt. The real question isn't whether those Americana ads were good or bad. It's whether any ad could have worked once Bud Light stopped being a beverage and became a symbol. Because once a product is drafted into a culture war, every frame, every song choice, every flag in the background reads like a vote. And as the weeks rolled on, the numbers would show exactly how expensive that symbolism could become. And as the weeks rolled on, the numbers would show exactly how expensive that symbolism could become. There was a time when Bud Light's sales charts were as boring as a metronome. Same lines, same rhythm, year after year. Then April 2023 hit, and those lines didn't bend, they fell. Early Nielsen, scans, and industry trackers started whispering the same story. In key weeks right after the backlash, Bud Light's U.S. sales volumes were down roughly 25 to 30% compared to the year before. Not in some tiny region, nationally. For a brand that had ruled as America's best-selling beer for roughly 2 decades, it was like watching a skyscraper lose 10 floors overnight. To understand how violent that is, let me take you back to how this category usually behaves. Mainstream beer is slow, heavy, conservative. Volumes drift a point or two in a good year, maybe 3 in a bad one. Big brands don't suddenly crater, they erode, they fade. Seeing a quarter to a third of volume evaporate in weeks wasn't just unusual, it was almost unheard of for a label that size. Distributors who had built a life around that blue logo were suddenly staring at pallets that wouldn't move. Because this wasn't only about one can or one influencer, the damage didn't stay in a neat little box marked Bud Light. As the boycott shifted from product to parent company, the chill spread across the Anheuser-Busch empire. Some sister brands, from Budweiser to Michelob Ultra, started posting declines too. Bar owners reported regulars asking for anything not owned by them. Shelves that had once been a Bud family reunion became a quiet game of musical chairs as retailers nudged competitors into the empty space. On Wall Street, the numbers hit even harder. Anheuser-Busch InBev stock began swinging by billions of dollars in market value as fresh sales data leaked out. One week, analysts insisted this was a temporary flare-up. The next, after another brutal print, they wondered if the brand had crossed a line it could never fully walk back. Because when a product turns into a proxy war over identity, investors aren't just modeling revenue, they're modeling resentment. It's an example of what happens when a company underestimates how fast culture can move and how slow a balance sheet can be to forgive. His story is one of money turning into power. Bud Light's, at times inspiring and at times chilling, was power turning back into vulnerability. And while Bud Light bled share in real time, case by case, something else was happening in the background. Another label, long treated as a challenger, was quietly stacking gains, filling in the gaps, and preparing to step into the crown Bud Light had worn for so long. The changing of the guard wouldn't come with a single headline. It would arrive the same way those early numbers did, buried in spreadsheets and scanner data, until one day the chart showed a new name at the top. Those charts on a Wall Street screen might have looked cold and abstract, but every percentage point sliding away from Bud Light was hitting real families, real warehouses, real paychecks in the middle of America. There was a time when beer moved through the country in a straight, almost invisible line. Breweries brewed, retailers sold, and in between sat an army of local distributors. This three-tier system was built to prevent any one empire from controlling everything, but it also meant Bud Light's fate didn't just live in a corporate tower in New York or Leuven. It ran through thousands of independent wholesalers whose life savings, loans, and retirement plans depended on that blue box moving off the shelf, day after day. Let me take you back to those first chaotic weeks of the backlash. While social media raged and cable hosts shouted, the phone started ringing in distributor offices in Texas, Florida, Tennessee, rural Pennsylvania. Not with polite questions, with bar owners threatening to pull every Bud Light tap, with store managers canceling promotions, with longtime customers saying, quietly but firmly, "We're switching to Coors, to Miller, to anything else." These were not abstract culture war arguments. They were Monday morning order sheets that suddenly came in half empty. Drivers reported walking into conservative bars where Bud Light handles were literally turned around, or where a handwritten sign over the cooler door said, "No Bud products until further notice." For wholesalers who had spent decades sponsoring local Little League teams and county fairs under the Bud Light banner, the speed of the turn felt ruthless. Because of a decision made in a distant marketing meeting, multi-generation family businesses were now staring at double-digit volume declines. Some owners talked about feeling blindsided, saying they had no warning, no chance to prepare their customers, no real script beyond a corporate press release that pleased no one. His story is one of global power and scale, but down here the story was unpaid overtime, emergency bank calls, and quiet conversations about whether long-time employees would have to be let go. It's an example of what happens when a national brand forgets that its real frontline is not the ad agency, but the guy stocking the cooler in a gas station at midnight. Distributor associations demanded answers. Private calls with Anheuser-Busch leadership grew sharper. Who approved this? Why weren't we told? What is the plan to win these people back? That pressure didn't stay local, it climbed. Inside the company, careers began to wobble. Marketing leaders were quietly reassigned or placed on leave. New voices were pushed forward to talk about refocusing on core customers, a polite phrase that barely concealed the panic. The empire was adjusting its front, not out of moral awakening, but because the middle of the chain was bleeding and threatening to bolt. And while Bud Light scrambled to reassure its own wholesalers, something subtle was happening on those same delivery routes. When a bar dropped a Bud Light tap, the replacement was often another light lager. More and more, the handle going in wasn't just Coors or Miller. It was a golden label from Mexico quietly sliding into place. Modelo Especial. Modelo Especial did not arrive with fanfare or fireworks. It arrived with a cold glass, a lime wedge, and a reputation that had been quietly compounding for years. There was a time when Modelo was a niche import, tucked away on the bottom row, ordered mainly in Mexican restaurants and neighborhood bars with Spanish on the TV. But let me take you back to the decade before Bud Light's fall. While the old American giants fought each other for the same aging drinkers, Modelo was moving in a different direction, rising year after year among Hispanic families, second-generation kids, and younger drinkers who wanted more flavor without jumping all the way to craft beer. On paper, it looked simple. A Mexican lager with a fuller taste, a little more body, and a golden label that signaled just enough premium without scaring anyone's wallet. In reality, its story is one of deliberate engineering. Constellation Brands, which controls Modelo in the US, had spent years pouring money into distribution routes, refrigerated shelf space, and tap handles, turning what used to be an import treat into an every weekend habit. They pushed Modelo into stadiums, music festivals, and taco spots. They negotiated for end caps in grocery stores and visibility in gas stations. Marketing framed it as an elevated everyday beer. Not champagne, not a rare craft release, just a step up from the watery light lagers that had defined American beer life for decades. Because of that positioning, every time a paycheck hit, upgrading from a light domestic to a cold Modelo felt like a small, affordable luxury. Crucially, the brand image stayed clean. Modelo was flavorful, a bit more premium, wrapped in that foil-topped bottle that felt distinct, but it wasn't waving any ideological flag. No major culture war narratives, no headline-grabbing campaigns, no attempt to turn the beer itself into a moral statement. While other brands chase social relevance, Modelo chased ritual. The backyard carne asada, the pay-per-view fight, the Sunday soccer game where the cooler was as important as the TV. So when Bud Light suddenly became a symbol, Modelo remained just a beer. Cold, consistent, socially neutral at the exact moment neutrality turned into a rare and valuable asset. To the angry boycotter, it wasn't a lecture. To the apolitical drinker, it wasn't a risk. It was simply there, waiting on the same shelf space that Bud Light had opened up by stumbling. And here's where the story turns. Did Modelo win because it was better, or because it wasn't Bud Light? Was this the triumph of a carefully built empire of flavor and distribution, or an example of what happens when one brand steps out of the line of fire while another walks straight into it? The sales charts would give one answer. The next part of this story complicates it. By mid-2023, the sales charts were no longer a warning, they were a verdict. Bud Light, after roughly 2 decades on top, had been passed. Modelo Especial was now America's best-selling beer, and the most ruthless part of this twist is that it didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened in grocery aisles and gas station coolers, one shelf at a time. There was a time when Bud Light owned those shelves almost by default. Huge blue walls at Walmart, floor-to-ceiling stacks in convenience stores, end caps at the end of every beer aisle, glowing like little altars to light lager. Retailers gave Bud Light that space because it moved, fast. But when the backlash hit and demand sagged 25 to 30% in key weeks, the quiet laws of retail kicked in. Space is money. Dead space is a problem. Retailers live and die on what sells this weekend, not what sold last decade. So as Bud Light cases slowed, managers did what they always do. When a giant stumbles, they rebalanced. A few facings disappeared here. An end cap was reassigned there. The algorithm in the back office, tracking scan data, simply pushed more room to whatever was climbing. And in store after store, that meant Modelo. Let me take you back to that moment when the visual started to flip. The blue mountains of Bud Light that once dominated the front of the aisle shrank to modest hills, while gold and white Modelo towers quietly grew taller. The big promotional displays near the entrance, the ice-cold tubs by the checkout, the cardboard standees that scream, "Buy me," from 20 feet away. Many of them changed jerseys almost overnight in some regions. To the casual shopper, it looked like nothing more than a slightly different skyline of cardboard and aluminum. But that subtle shift had power. When a brand stands in the front row, at eye level on the end of the aisle, it feels like the default choice. When it slips to the side or loses a stack, it suddenly looks like yesterday's news. That's how an empire erodes, not in dramatic explosions, but in 1,000 tiny rearrangements. Once Modelo took that front row, a self-reinforcing loop began. More visibility meant more curious shoppers grabbing a 12-pack just to try it. Those extra scans at the register made the sales data look even better. Stronger data justified even more shelf space and more end caps. More space pulled in more buyers. The loop tightened week after week, at times inspiring and at times chilling in how automatic it felt. And this wasn't a hostile takeover, no secret conspiracy in a back room. It was gravity. Retailers followed the path of least resistance toward what customers were actually buying, protecting their own margins while two global giants traded places on the leaderboard. Because of that, by the time executives were still arguing about brand identity and damage control, the front lines had already moved. The store had chosen its champion. The next part of this story shows what happens when a brand realizes that too late and tries to claw its way back from the edge. By early summer, the sales charts finally caught up with what was already happening in the aisles. Quietly at first, then with a sharp, almost surgical edge, the numbers turned on Bud Light. Industry trackers like Circana and Nielsen started flashing the same message. By around June 2023, Modelo Especial had become the top-selling beer in the United States. Not in some niche category, not in a single region, in nationwide retail sales. The empire that had ruled for roughly 2 decades had been pushed off the throne by a rival that, for many viewers, had once just been another bottle behind the bar. There was a time when Bud Light's dominance looked untouchable. Week after week, year after year, it sat at number 1, while executives talked about share points the way generals talk about territory. But as the boycott dragged on, the scoreboard changed. In measured retail channels, Modelo edged past Bud Light in dollar sales, a few percentage points at first, then enough to erase a generation of bragging rights. That phrase, top-selling, mattered. It did not just mean more cans moved. It meant more money. In this world, the metric that decides winners is often retail dollar sales, not just sheer volume. Retailers care because dollars determine which brand earns the best shelf space, the end caps, the cold box real estate that turns casual interest into habit. Investors care because high-value sales drive margins, bonuses, and stock prices. When Modelo's price point and momentum combined, it overtook Bud Light where it hurt most: revenue per week, per store, across the country. It's an example of what happens when perception and purchasing behavior suddenly line up against a brand instead of for it. The symbolic weight was even heavier than the financial hit. For the first time in about 20 years, Bud Light was no longer America's #1 beer. That was not just a data point. It was a psychological break in the story Anheuser-Busch had been telling about itself, about its power, about its place in American life. A label that had grown up alongside barbecues, ball games, and family gatherings was now officially second best. On paper, it was a ranking. In practice, it felt like a verdict. Headlines did not miss the chance to twist the knife. Bud Light dethroned. Modelo is the new king of beers, a new ruler in America's beer aisle. A few words, repeated across financial pages and social feeds, turned a quarterly sales shift into a cultural moment. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the story was framed as a changing of the guard. A Mexican import rising while a domestic giant stumbled through a self-inflicted crisis. And under all that noise sat a quieter, more ruthless question. Losing the crown was one thing, but in a market this polarized, what would it actually take to win it back? The next phase of the story would show whether Bud Light still had the strength to climb, or whether the fall had only just begun. On the surface, it looks almost absurd. America's best-selling beer for roughly 20 years, dethroned by a single Instagram post and one custom can that never even hit store shelves. That's the easy story, the viral story, the one that lets everyone feel powerful about a boycott and ignore the slow leak that started long before the blowout. Because there was a time when Bud Light didn't just sell beer, it sold a lifestyle. Tailgates, barbecues, cheap nights out, where nobody asked too many questions about taste. But look beneath that surface, and another story appears. Younger drinkers were already drifting toward hard seltzers, toward hazy IPAs, toward tequila in a can and anything that felt new. Light lagers were losing gravity, and Bud Light was losing the one thing it needed most: relevance. For years, that decline hid behind scale. When a brand is everywhere, in every bar, every stadium, every convenience store cooler, the empire looks unshakable. Yet that same reach created a quiet weakness. Bud Light became everyone's beer, which meant it was no one's passion. People bought it because it was there, because it was fine, because it was easy, not because they loved it. So when controversy hit, millions who once grabbed a Bud Light without thinking suddenly had to choose, not between Bud Light and poverty or Bud Light and wealth, but between Bud Light and literally anything else in the fridge. And with no deep loyalty, no emotional moat, that choice was effortless. They simply walked away. This is where brand fatigue creeps in. Decades of similar ads, similar jokes, similar blue cans promising the same light, crisp, nothing too challenging experience. The life of the party that never changed its story. At first, that consistency felt safe. Over time, it felt stale. When the backlash exploded, Bud Light did not have a reservoir of goodwill to draw from, only a long file of mildly amusing commercials and a taste most people described as fine. Now here's the pattern interrupt. Instead of asking why Bud Light fell so fast, ask why it stood so long without building deeper loyalty. How did a beer with so little real devotion manage to dominate for decades? The answer is power of distribution, habit, and price, not passion. It's an example of what happens when a brand rides momentum instead of meaning. So when a polarizing can met a tired brand in a fractured culture, the result looked sudden but was years in the making. The next part of this story isn't just about one marketing mistake. It's about what happens when an aging giant is finally forced to decide who it really wants as family and what that decision costs. There was a time when buying coffee, sneakers, or beer was just an errand, not a declaration. Today, that same cart at the checkout line can look like a ballot. One brand signals tradition, another signals rebellion, and suddenly, the most ordinary products in American life are carrying more political weight than many politicians. Over the past decade, companies have chased meaning the way Rockefeller chased money, turning logos into flags and campaigns into manifestos. A chicken sandwich becomes a referendum on religion. A sneaker ad becomes a protest march. A coffee chain becomes shorthand for a whole tribe. It's an example of what happens when culture fractures. People reach for simple symbols. A can in your hand becomes an easy way to say, "This is my side, this is my family, this is my world." Into that landscape walked Bud Light, a brand that had lived for years on jokes, tailgates, and just here for a good time energy. The Dylan Mulvaney partnership in isolation was tiny. A personalized can, a March Madness post, a small, inclusive nod in a sea of content. But in a culture already primed for conflict over gender and tradition, that quiet gesture was instantly rewritten as a battle cry. Overnight, a limited influencer promo was reframed as a full ideological pivot. Because the outrage machine was already built and waiting, the reaction was immediate and organized. Country musicians filmed themselves shooting cases, bar owners announced bans, politicians recorded speeches in front of beer coolers. Viral clips stacked up, each one louder than the last, each one insisting that this was not just about beer, but about an attack on a way of life. The anger had choreography, it had leaders, it had a script. On the other side, the support was real, but far less coordinated. Some customers quietly kept buying. Others posted messages saying a brand that showed a little kindness deserved a little loyalty. But quiet support does not flood phone lines, does not terrify wholesalers, does not make retailers rearrange shelves. Outrage concentrates. Approval diffuses. In a market driven by noise and fear, that asymmetry is a form of power. And under all of it sat a deeper weakness. Bud Light had never seriously told the world what it stood for beyond fun, lightness, and volume. No clear values, no deeper story, just an aging party soundtrack. So when the culture war knocked on the door, the brand had no moral vocabulary, no North Star to point to, no way to say, this is who we are, this is who we're not, and this is why. The empire of easy laughs suddenly needed a creed and found only taglines. Let me take you back to the core question, hiding inside this chaos. In a world where everything is political, can a mass market beer ever stay neutral again? Or does the next chapter of this story belong only to brands willing to choose a side and live with the cost? There was a time when Bud Light's message was perfectly clear. Fun, light, everywhere for everyone. Then the Dylan Mulvaney can turned a March Madness promo into a national referendum, and suddenly every word from the company carried more weight than the beer itself. Under that pressure, the empire of easy laughs tried a new strategy. Say as little as possible to as many people as possible. The first public statements after the backlash were masterclasses in non-committal language. Executives talked about bringing people together over a beer, about never intending to be part of a discussion that divides people, and about focusing on our heritage of brewing great beer. It sounded safe. It also sounded like nothing. No direct defense of Mulvaney, no clear apology, just a haze of unity words designed to offend no one and reassure everyone. But in a high-salience cultural fight, that kind of haze becomes a spotlight. On the right, the narrative was already locked. Bud Light had gone woke, betrayed its core drinker, and joined the enemy camp. A few bland lines about togetherness did not erase Kid Rock shooting cases, or bar owners reporting taps gone dry. To that audience, the silence on the underlying issue confirmed the worst. The brand cared more about coastal approval than about the people who made it number one for 2 decades. On the left, the reaction was almost a mirror image, just inverted. Advocacy groups and progressive voices watched the company retreat from the partnership, watched the brand avoid even saying the word trans, and saw Mulvaney publicly describe feeling abandoned. Let me take you back to that tension, a global giant with billions in market value on the line and a single creator left holding the cultural bill. To many progressives, it was an example of what happens when a corporation wants credit for inclusion without accepting any of the cost. Inside Anheuser-Busch, the moves did not look like moral clarity. They looked like triage. Reports surfaced that the Bud Light marketing vice president and a key executive were put on leave. The message to the outside world was, no one did anything wrong. But the internal signal was obvious. Someone had to be symbolically sacrificed. Because of that, the brand looked not principled, not defiant, just frightened. In moments like this, middle-of-the-road messaging does not read as balance, it reads as weakness. The company tried to pivot back to apolitical Americana ads, leaning on Clydesdales, flags, and nostalgic bar scenes, yet every new commercial was dissected as either cowardly backpedaling or cynical damage control. His story is one of relentless efficiency. Bud Light's story in 2023 was one of hesitation, delay, and hedging. By trying to please everyone, the brand satisfied no one and prolonged the crisis. So if it could not talk its way out, could it simply wait? Could time, discounts, and habit rebuild what a few weeks had shattered? Or had America quietly decided that the reign of its best-selling beer was finally over? Waiting, though, was not happening in a boardroom chart. It was happening on sticky floors and under neon signs. There was a time when Bud Light's blue logo on a tap handle felt as permanent as the bar itself, as automatic as asking for a light without specifying which one. Then, almost overnight, that easy habit turned into a test. Let me take you back to a downtown bar in Chicago, a place where the TVs never go off and the IPA list is longer than the food menu. There, the backlash felt distant. The regulars still ordered Bud Light out of muscle memory. The younger crowd chased hazy double this and craft sour that, and the controversy lived mostly on their phones. Sales dipped a little, conversations flared for a night, and then the noise moved on. In cities like that, Bud Light's story in 2023 was one of background drama, not open revolt. Drive a few hours into a small Midwestern town, and the picture changes. The local bar owner remembers the week after the Dylan Mulvaney can went viral as the moment the room went cold. Men who had ordered Bud Light for 20 years pushed the menu back and said, "What else you got?" Some refused to sit at tables with Bud Light buckets on them. A few told the owner in a voice that left no doubt that keeping the tap meant choosing a side. Because of that pressure, the bar became a stage. Patrons demanded tap changes, threatened to leave one-star reviews, and praised the places that made a public show of pulling Bud Light handles. In one southern roadhouse, a hand-lettered sign appeared on the door, "Bud Light free since 2023. It was part joke, part marketing, and entirely effective. People took photos, shared them online, and ordered other beers with a sense of participating in something larger than a drink choice. Not every owner wanted that role. In a college town sports bar, the manager taped up a different sign. "We pour beer, we don't do politics." On paper, it sounded neutral. In practice, it meant long, tense conversations with customers on both sides, each reading the same sentence as quiet support for their view. It's an example of what happens when a brand becomes a proxy war. Even silence sounds like a speech. Caught between loyalty, money, and fear of online mobs, staff became unwilling frontline spokespeople for a multinational empire. Servers were quizzed at the table about corporate values. Bartenders were filmed as they answered questions they had never been trained for. Managers fielded emails demanding boycotts, apologies, or both, while just trying to make payroll. Then a pattern interrupt. Forget the CEO, the influencer, the hashtag. Sit with the local bartender at midnight on a Friday, wiping down the bar, staring at a half-full Bud Light keg that used to be empty by Thursday. This person is not calculating market cap or legacy. This person is wondering which beer can be poured that will not start an argument, which choice will keep the room calm, the tips steady, the doors open. Because behind the national headlines and the charts showing Modelo rising as Bud Light fell, Life in these places moved in small, anxious steps. One tap change here, one angry regular there, one social media post that suddenly brought strangers from 3 states away. The story of America's best-selling beer losing its crown was written one awkward order at a time, and those awkward orders were about to reshape what wholesalers delivered, what shelves displayed, and what America's beer even meant next. Those awkward orders were happening in real time, but somewhere else a very different drama was unfolding. While one regular at the bar was quietly switching to Modelo, a conference room full of analysts was staring at a chart asking a colder question: is this a headline risk, or is the empire cracked? On Wall Street, there was a time when Bud Light was treated like a utility. Predictable, boring, dependable cash. Now, after one influencer can and a wave of outrage, research notes started flying. Some called it a temporary flare-up, a few noisy quarters before drinkers drifted back. Others whispered a harsher phrase: structural brand impairment. That's the language people use when they think a brand's life has been permanently shortened. Let me take you back to those first weeks. Anheuser-Busch InBev's market value didn't just wobble, it swung by billions of dollars as traders tried to price not only lost sales, but lost faith. Because when a best-selling beer suddenly looks vulnerable, the fear isn't just fewer 12-packs this summer. The fear is that the story people tell themselves about that beer has changed, and with it, the invisible asset that justifies decades of advertising money, brand equity. On spreadsheets, that showed up as models being rewritten. Lower volume assumptions, weaker pricing power, higher promo spending just to hold shelf space. Each line item was a quiet admission that what once felt like near automatic wealth and power might now require a fight. It's an example of what happens when a product that once seemed almost apolitical gets dragged into a culture war it never prepared for. Out in real life, the logic sounded nothing like that. For many drinkers, switching beers wasn't an Excel decision, it was a moral stand, a running joke, or just self-preservation. One guy at a tailgate said he wasn't getting yelled at over a light beer and grabbed something else. Another filmed himself dumping cases in a driveway, more performance than portfolio management. Some regulars shrugged and ordered a different label simply to avoid the argument they knew would follow if that blue can hit the table. Here was the disconnect. On one side, earnings calls, risk frameworks, and calm voices insisting the portfolio was diversified, and the long-term fundamentals remained strong. On the other, viral memes, country songs, supermarket selfies, with empty Bud Light shelves and overflowing competitor stacks. Both worlds were reacting to the same event, but with completely different languages, time horizons, and stakes. And yet, when numbers and narratives collide like this, history shows something at once inspiring and at times chilling. The narrative usually decides how long the damage lasts. The next chapter in Bud Light's fall would be written not by quants, but by whoever controlled the story that came next. Because a brand is not born in a boardroom, it is born in the mind. Not in a logo, a jingle, or a Super Bowl ad, but in a shared story millions of people quietly agree on about what a product means and who it is for. There was a time when Bud Light's story was simple, cold, cheap, everywhere, the harmless background noise of American fun. That story had rules. It said this beer belonged at tailgates, barbecues, college parties, cheap hotel ice buckets, and ball games. It was the drink of people who did not want to think too hard about beer, money, or politics. In brand strategy terms, it was a tribal marker for a broad, vaguely defined crowd that cared more about hanging out with friends than about signaling virtue or rebellion. That vagueness looked like power. Then the Dylan Mulvaney promotion hit, and the story split. To many long-time drinkers, Bud Light was still just a party beer, the same blue can they had been buying for 20 years. To a loud faction on the right, it suddenly became a symbol of betrayal, proof that their everyday life was being invaded by a culture war they never asked for. To a different group, it turned into a symbol of bravery, a giant finally recognizing a marginalized community, even if only through one personalized can and a short March Madness post. One product, 3 incompatible stories. This is the danger brand strategists fear most: identity, ambiguity. When different segments hold clashing beliefs about a brand's values and tribe, every six-pack becomes a referendum. The same can on a store shelf can mean I'm staying out of politics, I'm selling out my people, or I'm standing up for inclusion, depending on who is looking at it. That is not a positioning, that is a bar fight. Let me take you back to the foundation. Strong brands usually have a clear, articulated purpose that goes deeper than mass appeal. Nike has performance and aspiration. Harley-Davidson has freedom and rebellion. Their stories are, at times inspiring and at times chilling, but they are coherent. Bud Light's purpose had long been closer to, for everyone, everywhere, all the time. It sounded democratic. It also meant that when the empire was challenged, there was no solid ground to retreat to, because Bud Light had never clearly decided whose life it was trying to live alongside. It had no core tribe ready to defend it, no value system to point to, no language to explain the move without alienating someone. Every statement felt hedged, every silence felt loaded. It is an example of what happens when a brand spends decades chasing volume instead of meaning, wealth instead of identity, and then suddenly needs conviction overnight. And if Bud Light no longer knew which story it was telling, or which family it truly belonged to, how could it possibly decide who to talk to next, or what to dare to say when it finally opened its mouth again? When you surprise your most loyal customers, you'd better be very sure you know what you're trading them for. Because there was a time when Bud Light knew exactly who was holding up its empire, and then, almost quietly, it forgot. Let me take you back to Bud Light's heyday. The core drinker was not a Brooklyn creative workshopping tasting notes. He was an older millennial or Gen X guy, often without a college degree, living in the South or Midwest, measuring life in Friday nights, tailgates, and bar tabs. Football on Sunday, NASCAR on TV, country music in the background. The beer wasn't an accessory to that world, it was part of the uniform. For that core, Bud Light was woven into family rituals and regional identity. Weddings in VFW halls, coolers at Little League tournaments, 4th of July by the lake. Cases stacked in garages like a quiet sign of stability, a small luxury that still respected money. This wasn't premium wealth, it was dependable comfort. The brand story was simple, light, easy, always there. No lectures, no surprises. But inside the marketing department, the map was changing. Demographics showed aging drinkers, slowing growth, and a new generation clustering in cities, scrolling TikTok, drinking seltzers and cocktails. Leadership began chasing Gen Z, chasing urban tastemakers, chasing a future where the ideal drinker looked less like a factory foreman in Ohio and more like a 24-year-old in Los Angeles with 3 side hustles. On paper, that was strategic. In practice, it meant the mental picture of who Bud Light was really started to drift. Here's the problem. The emotional contract with that original base had never been renegotiated. For millions of longtime drinkers, Bud Light had decades of unspoken promises baked in. This is your beer, your crowd, your language. It will not embarrass you. It will not suddenly decide you are the past. Because of that contract, the logo on the can was not neutral branding. It was a quiet badge of belonging. So when the Dylan-Mulvaney partnership appeared as a single Instagram video and a personalized can, with no groundwork, no broader story, no bridge built to that core, it landed not as an evolution, but as a whiplash pivot. Overnight, the brand that had carefully stayed out of culture wars seemed to plant a flag in the middle of one. The move might have made sense on a slide deck about inclusivity and reach. To a guy who'd been buying a 30-pack every weekend for 20 years, it felt like a sudden declaration that the party had moved on without him. It's an example of what happens when a company thinks it is tweaking messaging, while customers experience it as rewriting the relationship. Because if Bud Light wasn't talking to him anymore, who exactly was it talking to, and what would that new conversation cost? The answer would arrive faster than anyone in that boardroom expected. The answer would arrive faster than anyone in that boardroom expected. But it wasn't inevitable. There was a time when this story could have unfolded very differently, not with a panicked retreat, but with a clear decision about what Bud Light actually was. Let me take you back to a quieter, alternate timeline. Imagine that years before Dylan Mulvaney ever opened a personalized can on Instagram, Bud Light had been laying track, steady campaigns about hanging out with all kinds of friends, a visible pattern of partnerships across race, gender, orientation, age. Not a surprise pivot, but a slow, boring drumbeat. In that world, the Mulvaney post is not a shock. It is merely the next chapter in a clearly declared life of the brand. Because when a company says, plainly and consistently, "This empire is for everyone," the outrage machine still spins, but the narrative has less oxygen. Customers might disagree, might walk away, but they cannot claim they were ambushed. The relationship was rewritten in daylight, not in a weekend. Now picture a second path, the can goes live, the backlash explodes, and within 24 hours the CEO steps out, not hiding behind press releases, but speaking with uncomfortable clarity. He explains the intent, acknowledges the anger, and then does the one thing almost no one expected. He stands by Dylan Mulvaney, full stop. No half apology, no "we didn't mean to be divisive," just a cold, calm acceptance that some money will vanish. That move would have been ruthless in its own way. Because of that stance, certain distributors would still rage, some bar owners would still pull taps, sales might still crater in key regions. But the trade-off is different. Instead of losing trust on both sides, the company gains a spine. It becomes, for better or worse, predictable. In branding, predictability is a strange form of power. Then there is the opposite extreme, a world where Bud Light never touches this fire at all. No influencer likely to be dragged into a culture war. No partnerships that cable news can weaponize by Monday morning. The brand doubles down on apolitical fun, sports, barbecues, summer nights, the safe nostalgia of a simpler America that never really existed but sells extremely well. It's an example of what happens when a company chooses wealth over risk, protecting volume by avoiding any moral stance beyond "have a good time." Instead, Bud Light chose the middle. Vague statements about not intending to divide, nostalgic ads with horses and flags, leadership vanishing behind lawyers, while both critics and supporters felt insulted. That middle path looked cautious, but in a polarized climate, indecision is the loudest decision of all. So here's the pattern interrupt. Forget what Bud Light should have done. If you were in that CEO's chair, staring at 20 years of dominance and billions in market value, what would you have actually been willing to risk? So let's follow that question down from the corner office to the people who could not walk away when the cameras moved on. Because when a brand steps into a culture war and then flinches, the blast radius doesn't stop at the boardroom. It hits everyone with the least power to shape the decision. There was a time when a brand deal meant a weekend of comments and maybe a few angry DMs. Dylan Mulvaney got something else entirely. One personalized Bud Light can, one March Madness Instagram post, and suddenly her life turned into a national referendum. The outrage cycle locked on, amplified by celebrities, politicians, and talk shows that treated a trans creator as a symbol instead of a person. Then, as the noise rose, Bud Light went quiet. No clear defense, no clear embrace, just distance. The message to Dylan was simple and brutal. The empire had collected its marketing moment, then stepped behind the curtain while she took the hits in public. Because of that silence, the harassment didn't just spike, it metastasized. Every new headline about collapsing sales, every clip of destroyed cases in a supermarket aisle, became proof to her critics that she was now the villain who had killed a national beer. It's an example of what happens when a company wants the glow of inclusion without the cost of solidarity. The money, the reach, the power all sit on one side of the table. The vulnerability sits on the other. Meanwhile, far from social media, the anxiety was quieter but no less real. Brewery workers watching production lines slow. Sales reps walking into hostile bars where owners joked about getting rid of Bud Light for good. Drivers hearing from store managers that shelf space had been cut and wondering if their route would be next. None of them had signed off on a marketing brief. Yet they were the ones fielding insults in parking lots, explaining falling numbers to wholesalers, doing the math on mortgages and college tuition, while the brand's public stance shifted week to week. Inside Anheuser-Busch, LGBTQ+ employees and allies felt a different kind of whiplash. On paper, the company had diversity pledges, pride sponsorships, internal resource groups. In practice, when the backlash hit, leadership's retreat sent a colder signal. Inclusion was fine when it was quiet, expendable when it threatened sales. Composite conversations from inside the company tell the same story. A gay brand manager deleting supportive tweets after being warned to stay neutral. A trans contractor quietly asking HR whether future campaigns would still use creators like Dylan. A longtime ally, proud of the company's progress, suddenly wondering how to explain this moment to their own family. At times inspiring and at times chilling, this is the hidden layer of every culture war controversy. The loudest voices on cable and the biggest investors on earnings calls rarely pay the steepest price. Creators, low-level staff, local distributors, bartenders, drinkers who just wanted their usual order without a political argument, they all end up carrying the weight of decisions made far above their pay grade. Because beyond the headlines and the stock charts, this was a story of trust breaking in every direction. Influencers learned the brand would not stand next to them when it mattered. Drinkers felt mocked, then managed, then ignored. Distributors, once loyal partners in Bud Light's rise to number one, began to doubt whether the company still understood the people who moved its product. And that fracture at every level set the stage for something unthinkable just months earlier. A new beer quietly stepping in to claim the crown Bud Light had spent decades building. Let me take you back to the moment that shift became visible on the ground, not in press releases, but in cold cases and bar taps across America. On the surface, it looked sudden. One brand stumbles, another brand surges, and the crown simply slides from one bottle to the next. But there was a time when Modelo's rise was already written into the shelves, long before Bud Light's crisis ever hit social media. Let me take you back to the quiet work Constellation Brands did in the shadows of that empire. Years before anyone filmed a boycott video, Constellation was pouring money into a different story of beer. Mexican, authentic, and yet strangely aspirational. They sponsored boxing matches, soccer broadcasts, neighborhood festivals, and upscale rooftop bars, weaving Modelo into both working-class cookouts and polished city nightlife. Not only was it the beer at the backyard carne asada, it was the bottle in the ice bucket at the trendy taco spot with $18 entree. Because of that long campaign, Modelo didn't feel like a stranger to most drinkers. It felt like part of life. Constellation's marketing spoke in English and Spanish, leaned into family, heritage, and hustle, and never pretended the brand was above anyone. At the same time, the ads framed Modelo as a reward for grinding, a small symbol of personal power at the end of a long shift. Authentic, but elevated, familiar, but just polished enough to feel like progress. Demographics were doing their own slow work in the background. The Hispanic population in the United States was growing, not only in border states, but in the Midwest, the South, and suburbs that had once been monocultures of light lager. Mexican imports moved from niche to normal. There was a time when a Mexican beer in the fridge signaled a special occasion. By the late 2010s, it was just Tuesday. It's an example of what happens when population shifts. Cultural comfort and patient distribution all line up behind a single label. Then there was the taste. In an era when craft breweries were teaching people to chase IPAs, stouts, and sours, ultra-light lagers started to feel thin, like background noise. Modelo Especial, with a fuller body, a little more malt, a touch more bite, offered a bridge. Not a heavy craft bomb, but not water either. For many drinkers, especially those drifting away from the old light beer hierarchy, it hit a sweet spot. Flavorful enough to notice, smooth enough to repeat. Because of this, when Bud Light faltered, the market didn't have to invent a replacement. Distributors had already seen Modelo's numbers climbing for years. Retailers had already given it end caps, cooler doors, and draft lines. Bar owners already trusted that if they swapped a Bud Light tap handle for a golden black Modelo one, the keg wouldn't sit there aging in the dark. So when the outrage came, the switch was frictionless. Shelves were rearranged, orders rewritten, marketing dollars reallocated, not as a wild gamble, but as an acceleration of a trend already in motion. Bud Light wasn't just losing volume, it was losing it to a rival that had been quietly training for this moment. And that meant one brutal thing. If Bud Light wanted its crown back, it wasn't just fighting outrage and memes. It was now up against a better prepared enemy, one that had spent a decade advancing, while Bud Light was about to make its most fateful moves yet. There was a time when Bud Light was untouchable, the automatic choice at bar taps, stadiums, and backyard coolers, a quiet empire of blue cans and habit. Now the crown is gone, the throne is occupied by Modelo, and one brutal question hangs over the brand. Can the king return, or is this the part of the story where a giant learns to live smaller? In the world of brands, recovery is less like a viral apology tour and more like probation. First comes acknowledgement, a clear, unambiguous admission that trust was broken. Then repair, not slogans, but tangible moves. From changing leadership to adjusting incentives to reworking how decisions are made. After that, the longest stage begins, the one marketers hate to talk about. Years of consistent action, showing the same values in every ad, every sponsorship, every distributor meeting, until slowly people stop flinching at the name. But Bud Light's road is steeper than a typical crisis. This is not a skunky batch, a mislabeled can, or one tasteless commercial that can be quietly pulled. The Dylan Mulvaney backlash fused the brand to identity and values, to questions about who belongs in the American family and who decides. Because of that, every move now is read as a referendum on culture, not just on beer, and that makes the usual playbook feel dangerously fragile. So what are the options? One path is ruthless focus on core customers. That would mean speaking directly to the drinkers who fled, doubling down on country music, sports, and small-town imagery, making it clear that the brand understands the life of the people who made it number one for decades. Another path is a controlled reinvention, refreshed positioning, lighter, more self-aware campaigns, a reframed story of fun and togetherness that quietly distances the brand from the chaos without pretending it never happened. There is also the portfolio escape hatch. Anheuser-Busch could slowly accept that the blue can will never again command the same power and instead push growth through Michelob Ultra, Busch Light, and other labels. In that version of events, Bud Light becomes a cautionary tale inside a larger empire that still prints money, its glory years remembered, its influence diminished but not erased. The greatest temptation will be to chase everyone at once, to win back angry loyalists while also signaling virtue to critics and regulators. Yet trying to please all sides risks reopening old wounds, reminding casual drinkers of a controversy they had finally stopped talking about. It's an example of what happens when a brand forgets that silence can heal, but only if you stop poking the scar. Whatever Bud Light chooses, one thing is certain: even if it never retakes the top spot, its next decade will be dissected in business schools and marketing decks. Let me take you back to how those choices unfold, because the next moves will decide whether this story is at times inspiring and at times chilling, or just a slow fade into irrelevance. Because of Bud Light, every CMO in America suddenly learned a brutal truth. A campaign no longer just has a budget, it has a blast radius. There was a time when risk meant missed sales targets and wasted media spend. Now, every major decision carries a cultural risk profile, a shadow ledger that tracks not only money, but outrage, loyalty, and how fast a brand's empire can be dragged into the culture war arena. That shadow ledger starts with knowing who is actually in the room with you. Audience mapping is no longer a nice slide in a deck, it is survival. Core drinkers in rural bars, younger city drinkers on TikTok, wholesalers with thin margins, investors watching quarterly reports, activists on every side scanning for betrayal. Each group hears the same ad, the same partnership, as a different story about identity, respect, and power. Ignore that map, and a limited consent to one influencer can suddenly feel to millions like a referendum on their life. So the new playbook looks less like post and pray and more like wargaming. Scenario planning means asking before launch, not just, what if this goes viral, but what if this gets framed as an attack? What if a boycott trend starts tonight? What if a politician or celebrity turns this into their next talking point? Teams now stress test campaigns the way banks stress test balance sheets, running them against likely culture war interpretations, hostile headlines, and the most ruthless bad faith readings, then deciding whether the upside in wealth and relevance is worth the downside in fury. Inside the company, alignment becomes a kind of armor. Executives, marketing, PR, legal, sales reps walking into angry bars on Friday night, everyone has to understand the intent, the values, and the non-negotiables behind a campaign. If leadership signs off on identity-driven work, then vanishes when the first boycott video hits, The brand looks not principled but cowardly. It's an example of what happens when the family running the empire flinches at the first sign of resistance. And here is the harshest rule of this new landscape. Silence is no longer neutral. Once a brand steps into questions of identity and inclusion, it cannot quietly tiptoe back to just selling beer. The public will force a choice: either stand behind the decision, explain it clearly, and accept who walks away, or retreat, apologize, and accept who no longer believes a word you say. Both paths cost money. Only one preserves a coherent life story. But if this is now the terrain for giants with billion-dollar budgets, what does it mean for everyone without that armor? For creators, small businesses, even individual careers trying to navigate the same polarized currents with far less room for error. For anyone watching from a distance, this might feel like a story about a giant beer empire, billion-dollar market swings, and culture war theatrics. But the same forces that knocked Bud Light off its throne can reach into a YouTube channel, a local cafe, even the quiet personal brand built on LinkedIn at 2 a.m. after the kids are asleep. Scale changes. The dynamics don't. There was a time when a channel could post gaming videos for years, then casually drop a fiery political rant and assume the audience would just roll with it. Now that single upload can trigger the same cycle Bud Light lived through: outrage, amplification, boycotts, and a permanent rewrite of what the channel means. A neighborhood cafe that posts one clumsy statement about a protest, or a fitness coach who suddenly rebrands around a polarizing cause, can find out very quickly how fragile their social and financial safety nets really are. Underneath all of this sits something simple and ruthless: the unspoken contract with a core audience. Over years, Bud Light trained loyal drinkers to expect a certain life script: cheap, easy, apolitical fun. No lectures, no homework, no pressure. When the Dylan Mulvaney can appeared, many customers felt the contract had been changed without notice. Not because a single influencer is that powerful, but because people suddenly wondered what else the brand had quietly decided on their behalf. Creators and entrepreneurs live inside the same tension. Every upload, every menu choice, every sponsorship whispers a promise about who belongs in the family and what the relationship is worth when money and pressure collide. His story is one of algorithms and attention, at times inspiring and at times chilling, because the audience isn't just buying a product, they are buying a place in a narrative that makes their own life feel coherent. This is where the trade-off appears. Taking a public stand can forge deeper loyalty and sharp differentiation. A channel that clearly supports a cause may lose half its viewers and gain a smaller, fanatical core that follows everywhere. A cafe that plants its flag might repel casual customers and become a sanctuary for a devoted few. It's an example of what happens when a vague crowd turns into a committed community, and the price is paid in both wealth and reach. Yet trying to hover in the middle, wobbling between every side, often hurts the most. Bud Light's attempt to soothe everyone with bland ads and corporate silence pleased no one. It signaled fear, not principle. Clarity beats vagueness. People can respect a clear, uncomfortable stance more than a nervous shuffle that treats them like a problem to be managed. So here's the pattern interrupt. The real question is not, will you get canceled? It's, what are you willing to be known for when the pressure hits? When sponsors call, when comments turn hostile, when a post misfires and the numbers fall off a cliff, what contract do you refuse to break? Because the answer to that question quietly shapes every decision long before the spotlight ever arrives. And as the Bud Light saga shows, once that answer is exposed in public, There is no going back to the old story, only forward, into whatever identity remains. In the next section, that forward path becomes the central problem: how a wounded brand tries to rebuild a life after the break. Because once a brand's inner answer is dragged into daylight, something else becomes clear. The old idea of safety was always a myth. There was a time when beer seemed like the safest product on the shelf, a cold, neutral backdrop to barbecues and ball games, a kind of liquid wallpaper in American life. Yet, in a matter of weeks, that wallpaper tore, and behind it was a full-scale fight over identity, loyalty, and who gets to define normal. Beer had been marketed as a political comfort for decades, light, crisp, for everyone. Then one personalized can, one influencer post, and suddenly ordering a Bud Light at a bar was treated as a declaration. Not just about taste, but about which side of a cultural battle a person belonged to. A drink that once blended into the background became a frontline uniform. It is an example of what happens when a brand built on easy unity is pulled into a world that runs on division. And beer is not alone. Let me take you back to the last few years when coffee chains became lightning rods over holiday cup designs and barista training programs. When fried chicken sandwiches were framed as proof of virtue or vice. When even paper towels and razors were dragged into boycotts over ad campaigns. Coffee, fast food, household goods, all the quiet companions of daily life, turned into referendum ballots that fit in a hand or a shopping cart. Underneath all of this is a new engine of pressure: social media that pays in attention, outrage, and speed. Platforms reward anything that signals who someone is, so what a person drinks, wears, or watches becomes a quick shorthand for what they believe. A logo in a selfie, a cup in a car console, a six-pack on a tailgate, each becomes content, then commentary, then ammunition. Because of that incentive structure, almost every purchase can be turned into a flag, and almost every brand into a battlefield. In that world, the fantasy of a truly safe brand is fading. No category is neutral, no logo is guaranteed a pass. The new reality is managed exposure, clear values, and fast, honest communication when the storm hits. Brands that pretend the storm will never arrive tend to be the ones caught speechless when it finally does. Their silence interpreted as guilt, weakness, or contempt, depending on who is watching. So if safety is an illusion, the real question is no longer how to avoid risk, but how intentionally to choose it. In the next chapter of Bud Light's story, that choice comes far too late, and the cost of hesitation is measured in lost wealth, lost power, and an empire suddenly up for grabs. That cost wasn't spread evenly across the map. It hit like a tornado, skipping some towns entirely, flattening others overnight. From a distance, the Bud Light story looked like one clean national verdict. Up close, it fractured into dozens of different realities. There was a time when a headline like "America boycotts Bud Light" could pass as a reasonable summary. But let me take you back to spring 2023 on the ground. In parts of New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, bar managers reported some grumbling, a few loud declarations of switching brands, then life went on. Volumes dipped, but modestly. Shelves still carried Bud Light, coolers still needed restocking, and the outrage felt more like an online performance than a lived emergency. Drive a few hundred miles into rural Ohio, West Texas, or small-town Tennessee, and the story flipped. Here, the same can, the same influencer post, turned Bud Light into a symbol. Because of local culture, politics, and demographics, the brand was no longer just a light beer. It was a test of loyalty. Some bars filmed themselves dumping kegs, convenience stores pulled entire displays, and wholesalers watched as year-over-year sales didn't just soften, they cratered. The irony was brutal. The partnership that barely registered in some coastal neighborhoods detonated in places where Bud Light had once been a fixture of working-class life, family barbecues, and Friday night games. In blue urban districts, it was another internet controversy in a long week. In red counties, it was proof that a familiar brand had crossed a line. The same ad buy, the same tiny influencer budget, translated into a shrug in one zip code and a bonfire in another. For a national brand, that's the nightmare. One message must travel through a country that no longer shares a single culture, but a patchwork of microclimates, each with its own weather system of values and resentments. Because of that fragmentation, every campaign risks being harmless in Seattle, radioactive in Birmingham, and invisible in Phoenix. It's an example of what happens when a company still thinks in terms of the American consumer, while the audience has already splintered into tribes. So the question quietly haunting every boardroom became, how do you speak to all of America without igniting half of it? The emerging answer is uncomfortable. Future campaigns may need to be carved up region by region, with certain themes pushed hard in one market and quietly shelved in another, even if that means giving up the dream of a single unifying message and a single dominant empire of brand identity. But in a culture this fragmented, can any beer, any logo, still be truly national in the way Bud Light once was? Or is that entire model about to collapse in the next chapter of this story? There was a time when a company could buy a Super Bowl ad, call it the official story, and everyone else just listened. Bud Light learned very publicly that those days are gone. In 2023, the brand discovered a brutal modern rule. Once a narrative catches fire, the brand is just another character in someone else's script. Let me take you back to the week after that Dylan Mulvaney appeared on Instagram. Anheuser-Busch had its talking points, its internal memos, its careful press language. But online, none of that mattered. Within days, user-generated content exploded past anything the company could publish. Boycott videos, bar fridge tours, backyard Target practice with Bud Light cases, and a flood of memes turning a single promo into a symbol of betrayal. Because of that wave, the ratio of control flipped. Official Bud Light posts drew a few thousand likes. Viral clips mocking Bud Light pulled millions of views, stitched, duetted, remixed across TikTok, YouTube, and Twitter. Country musicians announced boycotts on stage. Small-town bar owners filmed themselves swapping tap handles, and every late-night monologue squeezed in one more punchline. The brand still had its marketing budget, but the audience had something stronger: narrative momentum. Once the story hardened into Bud Light turned on its base, every new fact snapped into place around that idea. The can was limited, not a national release. That became proof the company was sneaking in an agenda. Executives said it was just one influencer among many. That was framed as spin. Even when sales data showed Modelo finally overtaking Bud Light, it wasn't read as a complex market shift. It was held up as a clean moral verdict, a kind of cultural scoreboard. Here is where life gets especially punishing for a big brand. Any attempt to correct the record tends to be read as damage control. Clarifying statements look lawyered. New ads look desperate. When Bud Light tried to pivot back to horses, flags, and classic Americana, critics on one side called it cowardice, while critics on the other called it pandering. Because the story already said the company was driven only by money and fear, every move was interpreted as proof, not contradiction. It's an example of what happens when power meets a crowd that can talk back. In the age of social media, a company can start a story with one can, one influencer, one campaign. But the audience decides the genre, the villains, and the ending. That is a humbling reality for any empire of brands that once assumed it could script public opinion from the top down. Understanding that loss of control is the first real strategic question. If a narrative might run away from you, should you chase cultural relevance at all? Or is there a smarter way to step into the fire without being consumed in the next phase of this story? To answer that, let me take you back to other moments when outrage tried to turn into economic power and quietly failed. There was a time when people swore they'd never drink Starbucks again, never buy Nike, never touch Chick-fil-A. Hashtags trended, cable panels shouted, and then, a few weeks later, the lines at the drive-thru looked exactly the same. Those boycotts were loud, but the products were sticky. Coffee habits are ritual, woven into the fabric of a morning. Fast food is tied to convenience, children, family routines. Shoes are wrapped in identity and long-term loyalty. Switching feels like work, or like breaking with a piece of personal history, so the anger cools faster than the habit can change. Bud Light walked into something different. Beer is a commodity with a flag painted on the side. The liquid is similar, the labels are not. Because of that, the cost of switching is tiny. The symbolism is huge, and the decision is made in public. A shopper standing at a gas station cooler, or a friend showing up to a barbecue with a case in hand, is announcing a choice. And in a tense cultural moment, that choice suddenly looked like a statement. That's why this boycott did not just flare and fade on social media. It moved into bars, tailgates, fishing trips, union halls. Country singers filmed themselves shooting cases. Small-town bar owners quietly reordered their taps. Wholesalers, who live and die on volume, started pushing Modelo, Coors, and Yuengling a little harder. The product was easy to replace, the performance of replacement was visible, and the social rewards for switching were immediate. Time made the difference. Many consumer uprisings burn hot for a weekend, then vanish when the next scandal arrives. Here, week after week, scanner data showed Bud Light down double digits while rivals climbed. That is not just anger, that is muscle memory rewiring itself. Once a drinker discovers that the new brand tastes fine, is priced the same, and earns a nod from friends, going back feels unnecessary. Underneath, the boycott only worked because it tapped into doubts that were already there. Years of jokes about Bud Light's taste, fatigue with its advertising, a sense that the empire had grown arrogant, all of that was waiting for a spark. The Dylan Mulvaney can did not create the frustration. It gave millions of people a story for why they were finally switching. So the real question is not whether the boycott succeeded. The question is, what dormant habits did it unlock? When a product is this easy to abandon, and the new routine feels better, the storm ends, but the shelf space does not quietly move back. And that leads to a more unsettling possibility for every legacy brand watching from the sidelines in the next phase of this story. For every CMO watching those shelves quietly rearrange, the message was brutal and simple. One misread moment can erase a decade of dominance. Not because the ad was everywhere, but because the story about the ad was. There was a time when a legacy beer could run on autopilot, buy enough sports sponsorships, and trust that habit would do the rest. After Bud Light, that era is over. In boardrooms from soda to sneakers, the new reflex is caution. Especially for mass-market brands whose life depends on blue-collar volume, anything tied to identity, gender, or politics now looks less like a fun brand moment and more like a live grenade. The same CMOs who once chased culture are quietly asking, is this worth losing 25% of sales in a month? So the pendulum swings toward control, more internal approvals, more lawyers in the room, risk committees for what used to be a routine Instagram post. A single creator deal that once needed one brand manager might now require scenario planning, social listening simulations, and a pre-written crisis script. It sounds absurd until a personalized can for March Madness suddenly becomes a national referendum on your empire, your values, and your right to sit in the American fridge. Yet it will not all move in one direction. For some brands, Bud Light's stumble looks less like a warning and more like an opening. If the middle of the road is now the danger zone, then the edges start to look strangely safe. Challenger labels, upstart seltzers, even regional beers see a different kind of money and power here. Take a clear side, build a loyal tribe, and let the boycotts filter out customers who never loved you anyway. It's an example of what happens when the cost of pleasing everyone finally looks higher than the cost of clearly aligning with someone. But in the middle of that strategic chessboard sits a quieter casualty. Trans and marginalized creators whose lives are not theoretical talking points but daily realities now feel the chill. Brands still issue glossy DEI reports, still talk about inclusion on stage, yet behind closed doors the brief shifts from who represents our values to who might get us yelled at. The partnerships do not always vanish. They just move off the main feed, into smaller activations, into NDAs and private events, where the risk is easier to hide. Let me take you back to that shelf for a moment, because Bud Light's story will not just live in marketing textbooks. It will echo in which faces get cast, which flavors get greenlit, which slogans survive legal review. At times inspiring and at times chilling, this is how a single can quietly rewrite the ads you see, the products you're offered, and the voices that finally get amplified, or don't. And if a single can do all that to a company, what can it do to a person whose name is on it? Because for creators, influencers, public figures, there was a time when a brand deal was just easy money. Hold the product, say the line, cash the check. Now it can feel more like stepping into a culture war minefield with your face printed on the shrapnel. This is where the Dylan Mulvaney moment stops being a beer story and becomes a warning label. A trans creator posts one light-hearted Instagram video with a personalized Bud Light can, a tiny slice of a massive empire, and within days, the outrage machine lights up. Country singers smashing cases on stage, politicians grandstanding, timelines filled with calls for boycotts. The money from that deal was real. So was the risk that Bud Light would flinch when pressure hit. Creators watching from the sidelines saw something very clear. The paycheck is only half the contract. So the first lesson is ruthless due diligence. Not just, how much are they paying, but what happens when things go bad? Does this brand have a history of standing by talent, or quietly pushing them under the bus when shareholders get nervous? Look at Bud Light's response: leadership silence, confused press statements, ads trying to pivot, back to flags and horses that pleased almost no one. It's an example of what happens when a company wants the social credit of a bold partnership without the backbone to defend it. Second, any creator who treats one logo as their entire livelihood is playing Rockefeller-level monopoly with their own life. When sales collapse by 25 or 30%, when shelves get rearranged and Modelo quietly takes the crown, that brand can pivot, repackage, move budget. A human being cannot rebrand overnight. Diversified income streams, multiple sponsors, products you own yourself, give you something Bud Light lost in weeks: leverage. Then there are the personal red lines. Every creator needs them. Industries, causes, political campaigns, even certain categories of money that are simply off limits, no matter how large the number on the contract. Because once your audience sees you as a paid extension of a fight they never signed up for, your public image stops belonging to you. His story is one of oil and railroads. Yours might be energy drinks and live streams. But the trade-off between short-term cash and long-term trust has not changed. And finally, reading the cultural room. Let me take you back to that personalized can. The outrage wasn't only about beer. It was about identity being weaponized, about a creator's existence turned into a referendum. If you are queer, trans, religious, conservative, outspoken, or all of the above, your life itself can become the message a brand is really buying. Are you ready for that message to be aimed back at you? Because if creators are becoming brands, and brands are becoming political, where does that leave the average viewer trying to make sense of it all? And what happens when the next boycott isn't about beer at all, but about them? There was a time when a bad review meant a grumble at the diner, a few angry regulars, and then life moved on. Now, a single viral clip from a phone in your shop can do to a neighborhood business what the Bud Light boycott did to a national empire, just on a smaller, more personal scale. The money at stake is different. The devastation to a family can feel the same. A corner bar that leans on Bud Light for half its tap sales, a bakery accused of one offensive comment, a gym owner who says the wrong sentence in a live stream. They don't lose billions in market cap. They lose rent, payroll, and finally the keys to the door. It's an example of what happens when outrage travels faster than context. When a local name is suddenly dragged into a national culture war it never asked to join. So what does survival actually look like for a smaller brand caught in that crossfire? It starts long before the angry comments. Every business, even a two-person shop, needs a simple crisis plan. Who speaks for you when trouble hits? Which channels you use first? The email list, the Instagram page, the sign on the window. How quickly you respond before other people write the story of your life for you. Because when Bud Light went silent, then tried to please everyone with vague statements and forgettable ads, it pleased no one. A small business cannot afford that luxury. The owner's voice, calm and clear, can do what no corporate press release can. Acknowledge harm if it's real, correct the record if it isn't, and show that there is an actual human being behind the logo, not just money and fear. But the real work starts even earlier, with values. From day one, be painfully clear about what you stand for and what you will not do. That clarity should guide partnerships, signage, charity events, even which holidays you post about. When a decision lines up with a long, visible pattern, it feels consistent. When it appears out of nowhere, it feels like a stunt, and people react as if they've been tricked. Let me take you back to a quieter moment, before any crisis. A Saturday event where you shake hands, remember names, sponsor the school team, answer emails yourself. Those unglamorous habits build a layer of trust around your brand, a circle of customers who know you beyond the headline. When outrage hits, that circle can push back, defend you in comment sections, keep buying when strangers call for a boycott, because they know the story is more complicated. Here's the pattern interrupt. Don't imagine if your Bud Light moment comes. Imagine when. A misinterpreted post, a tense interaction on camera, a partnership someone hates. In that moment, will you have a plan, clear values, and real relationships, or just a logo waiting to be redefined by people who have never set foot in your business? The answer decides who writes the next chapter. Because that's the quiet terror behind the Bud Light story. This wasn't just a bad quarter. It was a glimpse of how fragile power has become. There was a time when a brand could ride decades of dominance, shrug off missteps, and trust that habit would protect it. Bud Light had the money, the distribution, the cultural presence, the illusion of an untouchable empire. Then one misread moment hit. and all that weight made the fall louder. Let me take you back to the dual frame of this story. On one side, it's an example of what happens when corporate ambition chases relevance without really knowing the life and loyalties of the people who built the brand. On the other, it's a troubling mirror of a culture ready to turn outrage into a full-time job. Both are true. Both are uncomfortable. Bud Light wanted to be more inclusive. That desire, in itself, is not the villain here. In a country where families, identities, and communities are more visible and more fragmented than ever, brands trying to speak to more people is understandable. The problem was not that they reached out. The problem was how shallow and tactical it felt when the pressure came. A one-off influencer can, a quiet Instagram video, then sudden silence when the fire started. No clear values, no real explanation, just retreat. Because of that, the move looked less like conviction and more like a marketing experiment gone wrong. To longtime drinkers, it felt like a betrayal. To new audiences, it felt disposable. That's the price of chasing relevance as a costume instead of a belief. When the storm hits, a costume comes off. A belief costs you something and you pay it anyway. His story is one of ruthless efficiency and control. Bud Light's is one of casual risk taken without that same depth of understanding. When Rockefeller expanded, he knew every cent, every barrel, every rival. Here, the company pushed into a culture war without mapping the terrain, without asking who might feel mocked, who might feel used, who might feel abandoned when the brand flinched. The result was not just lost wealth, it was lost trust. And that's the deeper moral. Power does not make a brand safe. Power makes its mistakes more visible, more emotional, more contagious. A local bar can offend 20 people. America's best-selling beer can offend 20 million before the weekend is over. So the hook is this. The next Bud Light moment may not involve beer at all. It might be your favorite phone, your bank, your streaming service, the brand that sits quietly in your kitchen right now. When their turn comes, and it will, the question will be whether they learned from this story or whether they hand the narrative over, one careless decision at a time. But here's the uncomfortable twist. Once a brand has been through a public beating like Bud Light, it doesn't just go back to being cold beer in a blue can. It carries scar tissue, not only in quarterly sales charts, but in late-night monologues, bar jokes, and the quiet smirk when someone brings a case to the party and the room goes a little too silent for a second. There was a time when Bud Light was a default, not a decision. It was what appeared in coolers at family reunions, tailgates, and backyard weddings without anyone reading a headline into it. Now, the can arrives with a story attached. It's the beer that got boycotted, the beer that went woke, the beer that lost its crown to Modelo. Even if volumes stabilize, that narrative hangs around, replayed in memes, in TikToks, in that one uncle's running commentary every holiday. This is brand scar tissue. Because of a single misread moment in 2023, a simple purchase now carries extra meaning, and that meaning is at times inspiring and at times chilling. Inspiring to people who saw a corporation punished for arrogance. Chilling to executives who realized one small promotion could vaporize decades of dominance and billions in market value. Yet markets have short memories and generations turn over. Let me take you back to a teenager walking into a gas station in 2030. The backlash is a half-remembered meme, not a lived experience. Their life has its own dramas, its own culture wars. To them, Bud Light might just be the cheap option on sale, the brand their friends grab because it's cold and there's a game on. The emotional investment of 2023 belongs to their parents, not to them. So the question becomes whether Anheuser-Busch can help that amnesia along. Could Bud Light reintroduce itself, not with patriotic montages and apologies that please no one, but with something genuinely new? A reformulated light beer with better taste claims, a line of higher-end sub-brands, a hard seltzer empire that quietly outgrows the original can, while keeping the logo small and the controversy smaller? Or does the company do something more radical? Retire the positioning that made Bud Light the all-American default and rebuild it as a niche. The value brand, the stadium brand, the no drama, just beer. Brand that almost dares people to keep arguing about a can from years ago while everyone else moves on. Because in some circles, none of that will matter. For political commentators, for marketing professors, for certain corners of the internet, Bud Light is now a shorthand for corporate miscalculation, for executives who misread their core customer, for what happens when a brand walks into a fight it doesn't understand. Whether Bud Light claws back its title or drifts into permanent middle-tier anonymity, one thing is fixed. The playbook proving how fast a king can fall now exists. It's an example of what happens when power meets complacency, and in the next chapter, someone else is already reading it line by line. There was a time when losing America's best-selling beer title would have taken years of slow decline, missed trends, and aging customers drifting away. Bud Light did it in days. So let me take you back to that first week, when one Instagram post and one commemorative can turn into a national referendum on a light beer. The post goes live, Dylan Mulvaney, smiling in a bathtub, holding a can with a custom face print, joking about March Madness. Within hours, the comments split. Praise, mockery, confusion. By the end of the weekend, outrage clips are ricocheting across feeds. Country musicians film themselves shooting cases. Bar owners quietly move Bud Light to the back, then loudly announce it on Facebook. Hashtags call for boycotts, then for counter-boycotts. Distributors start texting photos of pallets not moving. Sales reps walk into bars and hear the same line again and again. People are making threats. We're not touching that tap handle. Inside the empire, phones ring without stopping. Longtime wholesalers, some with family ties going back generations, want answers. Corporate social accounts are flooded with insults, memes, and promises that customers are done forever. Investors watch the first headlines about billions in market value swings. That first week is not about data. It is about panic, pride, and the sudden realization that a marketing play became a proxy war over identity and power. Now imagine the decision table in those 7 days. Option 1, stand firmly by the campaign. Release a clear statement, defend Mulvaney, frame it as inclusion, argue that a brand with Bud Light's wealth and reach can afford to lose customers who hate the move. The moral clarity is sharp, the risk is sharper. Because of the ruthless dynamics of culture wars, doubling down could turn a weekend fire into a year-long blaze. Option 2, fully apologize and retreat. Announce the partnership was a mistake, scrap similar plans, maybe even distance the brand from politics entirely. That might calm some distributors, reassure angry drinkers, and slow the bleeding. But it also tells every future activist, every loud voice online, that pressure works. It trades long-term control for short-term quiet, and it publicly throws a partner under the bus. Then there is the middle ground de-escalation. Say little, wait, push out a new back-to-basics ad with flags, barbecues, and horses, hoping to remind everyone this is just beer. It feels safe. It also risks pleasing no one, as the real story becomes the silence, the hedging, the sense that leadership is hiding. So here's the question. In that first week, what would you actually do? Not just what feels heroic. Whose trust would you protect first? The longtime customers who built the brand, the new audiences you claim to welcome, the employees watching for a signal, or the investors staring at the stock chart. The way you answer doesn't only reveal your marketing instincts. It reveals what kind of power you are comfortable wielding. And in the next section, the consequences of the choice Bud Light actually made will come into full view, at times inspiring and at times chilling. Because before those consequences came crashing in, there was a time when Bud Light didn't just sell beer, it floated above the market like an untouchable empire. For roughly 2 decades, it was America's best-selling beer, the default tap handle, the logo on stadium signs, bar coasters, NASCAR cars, and backyard coolers. Its presence was so routine that its dominance felt like weather. You didn't question whether it would still be there tomorrow. Then, let me take you back to the moment that quiet certainty snapped. Early 2023. A single influencer partnership, a custom Dylan Mulvaney consent for March Madness content, not a national rollout, not a sweeping rebrand. A tiny spend in a giant budget. Yet in a culture primed for outrage, it was enough. Within hours, a personalized can became a symbol, then a target, then a test of loyalty in a country already on edge. The boycott did not begin in boardrooms. It began on phones. Country musicians announcing they were done with Bud Light, bar owners posting videos of untouched kegs, influencers filming themselves tossing cases in the trash. Clip after clip, day after day, a rising drumbeat of anger that turned one marketing decision into a referendum on identity, masculinity, and who gets to own American beer. While executives drafted talking points, the story raced ahead without them. Because of that hesitant, fractured response, the brand bled from both sides. Official statements tried to downplay the partnership, then pivoted to patriotism, then went quiet. Leadership stayed mostly off camera. New ads leaned into flags, horses, and family gatherings, but landed as apologies to some and betrayals to others. It pleased no one, and in the vacuum, the narrative hardened. This was not just a beer anymore. It was a political statement you held in your hand. The numbers followed the story. In key weeks, Bud Light sales volumes dropped around 25 to 30% year over year. Distributors panicked. Retailers quietly shifted shelf space. Tap handles that had been locked in for years were suddenly up for grabs. And in that opening, Modelo Especial moved. Not with a viral scandal, but with steady demand, strong positioning, and no culture war baggage. By mid-2023, Modelo finally overtook Bud Light as the top-selling beer in the United States, turning what began as an online flare-up into a historic market shift measured in billions of dollars of company value. His story is one of money and power. This one is about brands and perception, yet the pattern rhymes. It's an example of what happens when a company misreads its audience, wanders into a culture war it doesn't understand, and believes its own invincibility press clippings. From long-standing wealth to sudden vulnerability, from automatic choice to active boycott, the crown did not fall slowly. It slipped in weeks. And now the question turns back to the viewer, because what people buy, how they build their own brands, and the way they speak into these conflicts will decide who wears that crown next, and for how long. So what does Bud Light's fall actually mean for the person watching this, for the life being built quietly between paychecks, side projects, and late-night ideas? There was a time when losing a crown like this would have taken years of slow decline. Now, one misread moment, one confused response, and the empire tilts in weeks. The first lesson is ruthless in its simplicity. Know your core audience. For decades, Bud Light knew exactly who kept the taps flowing. Bar regulars, tailgate crews, blue-collar families buying bulk on weekends. Then the brand tried to pivot its image without clearly bringing that core with it. Because the company did not speak directly to the people who had given it that long-standing wealth, those people felt replaced, not expanded. It's an example of what happens when a brand believes reach is more important than relationship. So turn that outward spotlight inward. Who is actually supporting the work being done right now? Not the imagined future fans, not the aspirational followers, but the real ones. The clients who pay on time, the manager who quietly advocates, the small online audience that shows up every week. If a sudden shift in tone, values, or aesthetics would make them say, "Wait, is this still for me?" That is the same crack Bud Light ignored until it became a canyon. The second lesson, be clear about values before a storm, not during it. When the backlash hit, Bud Light tried to be everything to everyone, silent with one audience, apologetic with another, patriotic in ads that pleased no one. Because the brand had never clearly told a stable story about what it stood for beyond light beer and funny commercials, any narrative could be projected onto it. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the internet will always write a story for any silence. This is where the third lesson lands. Never underestimate how fast narratives can flip. Social media outrage, distributor panic, late-night jokes, and suddenly a 2-decade champion is defending shelf space against Modelo. So let me take you back to the viewer's own world for a second. A single email, a screenshot, a clipped sentence on a call can become the story of a reputation at work or online. The speed is the same, only the scale changes. Here is the pattern interrupt. Stop thinking about Bud Light. Think about a personal week 1 playbook. If a controversy hit tomorrow, who would be called first? What would be said publicly? What would never be said at all? Written values, a short statement template, 2 or 3 trusted voices to sanity check reactions. Small tools, but they keep panic from writing the script. Because his story is one of money and power, Rockefeller feels distant. Bud Light feels closer. But the real story now is the one the viewer is writing. A tiny brand at a desk, in a group chat, in a neighborhood. Consumer, yes, but also builder. And the next move, not Bud Light's last one, is what will matter in the chapters ahead. Dominance used to feel permanent. There was a time when a number 1 brand could coast for decades, protected by habit, shelf space, and the slow pace of public opinion. Bud Light's fall ripped that illusion away. Years of marketing, billions of dollars, an empire of taps and stadium deals, and then, in the span of a few news cycles, the crown moved to Modelo. Not because the beer changed, because the story around it did. Let me take you back to what that really means. For 20 years, Bud Light sat on top of America's beer market, a fixture at barbecues, ball games, and family parties. Then one partnership, one personalized can, one influencer video collided with a culture war already running hot. Social feeds amplified outrage, politicians and musicians piled on, and within weeks, sales in key regions were down by double digits. Decades of dominance, undone at the speed of a trending clip. It's an example of what happens when culture, media, and missteps finally line up. His story is one of money and power. This one is about brands and attention. But the mechanics are eerily similar. Think about the untouchables of today. A streaming giant that assumes subscribers will never cancel, while a rival quietly spends on better shows. A fast food chain that treats drive-through lines as permanent until a viral video exposes a kitchen, a wage dispute, or a health scare. A tech company that believes its ecosystem is a prison, right up until a new device, a new app, or a new scandal gives people a door marked exit. Because the attention economy cuts both ways. The same feeds that turned Bud Light into a target can turn a challenger into a rocket. One clever campaign, one authentic spokesperson, one moment that captures a mood can send a small brand from poverty in market share to sudden wealth in awareness. Distribution deals follow. Investors wake up, and the old giant looks up to find that the ground has already shifted under its feet. So the next time a controversy explodes on your screen, watch it less like a fan and more like an analyst. Notice who frames the first clip, who repeats the talking points, who goes silent, who overreacts. Look at how quickly retailers rearrange shelves, how advertisers pause, how money and power move in the background while everyone argues in the comments. Outrage is loud, but mechanics decide who actually wins. Somewhere right now, in a glass office or a windowless conference room, a marketing team is approving a campaign they believe is small and safe. A limited run collab, a playful tweet, a niche sponsorship. It will go live quietly, maybe on a Sunday afternoon. And in a few months, the world may be studying it as the moment another king fell faster than anyone thought possible. There was a time when Bud Light felt untouchable, when its blue label was less a brand and more a background detail of American life. Now that empire has a crack running straight through the crown, and the question hanging over everything is simple and uncomfortable. Can it ever wear the crown again? Or was that last can opened at the top of the charts the final one? Because of this one partnership, one Instagram video, one spark in a crowded culture war, billions in market value swung, distributors panicked, and a rival beer quietly took the throne. It's an example of what happens when a company believes it's making a tiny, targeted move and instead discovers how ruthless a national conversation can become when money, identity, and loyalty collide. Some say the damage is permanent. Others say Americans have short memories and even shorter attention spans. So this is where the story turns to you. What happens next is not just about a logo in a boardroom. It's about the choices in millions of hands at gas stations, bars, and backyard coolers. Do you believe Bud Light can fight its way back to number one? Or has the market already passed sentence and moved on to Modelo and whatever comes after? Is this a temporary exile or the end of a long, frothy reign? Down in the comments, lay out the verdict. Should Bud Light double down and defiantly defend the path it chose, trying to build a new audience even if the old one never forgives? Should it reinvent itself completely, from ads to taste to identity, the way disgraced brands sometimes vanish and then reappear with a new face and a carefully edited memory? Or should it quietly accept life as a former king, a profitable but humbled label that no longer pretends to speak for the whole country? Let me take you back to your own fridge for a second. Did you switch beers? Was there a night when the usual case stayed on the shelf and something else went into the cart? Share that moment. Was it outrage, boredom, a better deal, or just the feeling that the party had moved on? And for anyone who left, what would it take to come back? A public apology, a total leadership change, years of silence, or nothing at all? His story is one of power and backlash. This brand's story is one of wealth and whiplash. If you want more deep dive breakdowns of how single decisions reshape entire industries, how one can, one tweet, or one deal can redraw the map of an entire market, hit subscribe, tap follow, and stay with this channel. Because in the end, markets are not abstract machines. They are made of choices. Yours, mine, and millions of others. Every can opened, every pint refused, is a tiny vote for the future. The next time that cooler lid lifts and your hand hovers for a second longer than it used to, remember that hesitation is where empires rise and where they finally fall.